We do have a very degraded natural landscape right across the UK. It doesn't have to be like this. There is so much more possible, and that does not have to threaten anybody. Restoring nature is a catalyst for social and economic regeneration. If we restore peatlands, we kind of turn off the tap of carbon dioxide. It's basically been released from our eroded peatlands.
So, Alan, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me today. And I've got loads of questions that I'm really excited to be asking you. So what is rewilding? You know, for someone that's never heard of it.
Well, usually you start that definition by saying there's lots of different definitions. It's a word that causes quite a bit of debate, sometimes controversy. But for us, rewilding is about allowing natural processes, nature to work at scale. And it's about how people interact with and coexist with that nature and benefit from it. And that second dimension of it is, you know, just the way I've described it, African Highlands, we see that as crucial. It's an intrinsic part of rewilding. It's not an add-on. So it needs to be about people and nature together and what that future looks like for the long term. We see nature as a catalyst, restoring nature as a catalyst for social and economic regeneration, for this repeopling agenda in the landscape to move. You know, some landowning businesses are, you know, perhaps looking at how financially sustainable are we going forward. So how could nature restoration, what opportunities it give to give them a stronger foundation for the future.
For those who don't know the African Highlands, could you describe the location and the wildlife that people could find there?
Sure. Yeah. I guess the first thing to say about it is big. So it's a big landscape. It is about 2,000 square kilometers in potential, and it is roughly centered on Glen Affric, and that is to the west of Inverness. And the area broadly runs east to west from Loch Ness to Loch Duach on the west coast, so quite close to Skye. You know, people kind of talk about rewilding and they see African Highlands as a rewilding project, but it is also a repeopling project, and in time create the conditions to allow more people to come back in this landscape and rebuild a connection with the land. So that's sometimes that kind of narrative gets a little bit lost when people talk about rewilding.
What's your role within the rewilding project, Alan, at African Highlands?
I've led its development. We sat in this office actually 3 years ago, and had a few of us, and we had a bit of a conversation about Trees has long had an aspiration to go east to west across through Glen Affric, actually, and that's a purely an ecological vision, and it had that since we were founded by Alan Featherstone. That was one of his driving goals. But as we kind of came to look at it more recently, we started to think, well, is this working? And it's probably not. So those pennies that dropped, the one that clunked loudest was when my boss Steve said, so this is actually about nature, people, and business. And those three things, when you think about they're interdependent. It's like a three-legged stool. And if you pull one of those away, or if you neglect one of those, sooner or later the others will fall. Mm. But if you instead say, let's use the interests of those three things together and how they can complement each other, then you start to, instead of looking at what could happen, it's bad, you start to open new horizons of what's possible. And that journey going forward is what African Highlands is about.
So how does rewilding and solving the climate crisis interlinked?
Well, certainly for Scotland, but I think for almost everywhere, really directly. So if in terms of that restoring natural process, that creates all sorts of opportunities to at least mitigate climate change. For us in this landscape and in the Highlands, the big issues are, and the reason actually Scotland, and particularly the Highlands, has been identified as of UK significance is through the land use and specifically the potential to prevent further large scale emissions that are coming from our peatlands. So if we restore peatlands, we kind of turn off the tap of carbon dioxide. It's basically been released from our eroded peatlands. And secondly, in the potential for different types of woodland creation, and so the potential of trees in the right place to draw down carbon. And so the parts of our landscape can then go carbon negative, to use one of the buzz phrases, and that's going to be key. If we can achieve that, that's going to help the UK get to a better carbon budget.
The peatlands are a really important ecosystem within Scotland that the whole of the UK benefits from, basically, in terms of that. Is that what you're saying there, Alan?
Absolutely, yeah. That's there's a huge carbon store there, and much of it is leaking out because the landscape and the surface of those peatlands has been eroded and degraded. That creates potential for the peat to oxidize, and in that oxidation process, it's releasing carbon dioxide at scale.
Right.
So reversing that means we can turn that off, and that instantly helps our effort to reduce and to try to stay a 1.5 degree rise.
And why is the peatlands being eroded? Is that grazing? Is that over farming?
It's centuries of grazing pressure from particularly from sheep in the past. As sheep came in here, the numbers they were ran at, they would cut through the kind of the peat surface. That's been complemented throughout that time by deer, particularly red deer in the uplands. And although sheep numbers have come down a lot in the last decade and a bit more, deer numbers have continued to rise. So it's that interrelationship between our natural herbivores and our unnatural herbivores in the case of livestock like sheep, and the ability of the land and the habitat to sustain that, whether it's that physical trampling pressure or foot pressure, and just what they're eating, what they're foraging on. So there's about 1 million deer in Scotland across the species. How many deer there should be, that's a much more controversial projection. But certainly we would agree that the number of deer, particularly in the Scottish landscape, is a long way out of proportion with the ability of the land to sustain that. And so we have this skewed ecological balance between the deer and their own habitat. And you can see that often, certainly with red deer, you can see that in the condition of the deer themselves. So they are smaller, they weigh less than deer in the continent. They'll have access to a more balanced habitat, access to more shelter and food that's provided by woodlands.
So stepping back from that a little bit, why did African Highlands and Trees for Life choose to join with Rewilding Europe, that is, gaining a lot of exposure within rewilding across Europe? Why did you choose to join with them for this project?
We got to know them. They approached us, and I think we just kind of started the conversation. We feel that we've got we just had a really natural fit with them. So they have a lot of expertise, for instance, in developing and supporting and fostering a nature-based economy. In terms of, you're talking about the opportunities I talked about and what communities and businesses need in this African Highlands landscape. They need a nature-based economy. And so Rewilding Europe have the enterprise expertise and the relationships in terms of how the investment can work for that. And that's a field that's evolving really rapidly at the minute. So just access to that experience was a big help for us.
One of the questions I was going to ask you, Alan, was around the sort of 3 biggest changes you've witnessed since starting the project. But I'm also conscious that you said you're at year 0.
Well, it probably is. It probably is apt to ask it, because actually the changes that we need and what will underpin it all is the human relationships. So when we stepped in and started pitching African Highlands, we knew that it would be an unusual proposal, and the nature of the land use debate, with its potential for polarization and controversy, means that kind of proposing means that people kind of work a wee bit in silos. So we can all be in our bubbles, and there's a conservation type bubble, and we were very much in that. And then there's a kind of a landowning bubble, and that was kind of continued quite separate, and they might have treated us with a degree of suspicion. And then the communities are perhaps in a different place themselves, and all of those groups are much more diverse. But still, there's a tendency with the conversations not to bridge, to move between those bubbles. So I would say probably the biggest change and certainly the most encouraging progress that we've made is being able to reach some hands across those divides, and have them accepted, not universally, but enough to make us think, okay, this proposal we have about those kind of common values that I talked about, that's got something in it. And there is, the question of trust remains a big one. But we feel that this is kind of the basis of something that can gradually win people around you. What we need to do now, and what people said to us actually soon after we first pitched it, that we had a couple of big meetings back in 2019. With landowners and some communities as well, and the general reaction was quite a cautious one, but like, okay, we like the principles you're talking about here. We can't disagree with those. What are you asking of us? What's it actually going to be? We're not rewilders. We don't like that word. It creates a bit of fear for us, and we're saying, well, we don't need to fear it. So we're at a point now where we need to kind of do more doing than talking, and let people judge for themselves. And we said all along, we can't make anybody join. Size up yourselves. Do you see positive opportunities here for yourself? Here's what we think they are, and make your mind up. And if you're in, great, and if you're not, fine. And we've got 30 years. Hopefully we'll see you somewhere down the line.
Absolutely. That's really interesting. So less about sort of visual things, people might expect at this point, which is, introduction of species or something like that. It's more been about forming those critical relationships to ensure the longevity of such a project, it sounds.
Yeah, to make it actually sustainable and real. Not just window dressing, not just, we're all forming this alliance and we'll get some money and we'll go off and do our things and get something out of it and go our separate ways after it.
Yeah.
But actually, long term, we're moving into a different paradigm. Rewilding is not defined by reintroductions, and don't get us wrong, we are in favour of reintroductions, and we're active with some species. But rewilding really is about those kind of natural processes working at scale. That is primarily remains habitat driven. So what's happening in the land, and what potential does that land create for nature, and for nature to be self-sustaining and self-determining? And so that's inspired by Trees for Life. Some Trees for Life's earliest work was in Affric, and it was volunteers, I mentioned, about planting trees from a bothy. It's 5 miles off the end of the public road, and real energy and enthusiasm going into planting and native species and creating habitat. And you go there now, nearly 30 years later, and you can see those trees that were planted are now starting to mature. They've had babies of their own, and you see this young, very natural forest that was started by people starting to spread across that landscape. And with that has come species return. So what was once just bare hillside with some heather and a few species of grass and some mosses is now this young woodland it's full of songbirds. It's got small mammals in it. We've got black grouse there. So it's a wee bit of kind of build it and they will come, create the habitat. Species can find it, and the way you can connect that, and the bigger scale you do it at, the richer and more powerful that ecological response is. And African Highlands is saying, this is possible for us, and we can use that to create opportunities for people.
Let's say I'm a farmer. I'm assuming some of the landowners you're talking about are farmers, and I want to be part of this project. What is the first step that I would take to rewild the land or change the land use, and what would I do essentially? What would be the first step?
Actually, there's not that much farming in this landscape. It's kind of up. There is farming there, though. A lot of it's kind of upland estate, generally managed for deer, would be the traditional activity here. However, we are one of our first project, or one of our first couple of projects that will get off the taxi rank with African Highlands is about nature friendly farming, working with a group of farmers who had already got together and formed what they call a farming cluster. And they're interested in nature-friendly farming. They've already done the kind of homework. Here's what we'd like to do. And that's kind of, so they've kind of looked at the land that they have and said, where are the opportunities here to bring more nature onto this farm in a way that we can continue to farm it in the way we want to. And so African Highlands has been able to attract some funding to allow that to happen. And we're just last night we got the wording, yes, this is going to be confirmed. The funding has come through. So, we're delighted with that. This farming cluster is delighted with that. And that's kind of, I guess that's sort of the model in terms of the land use side. Rebecca will have part of the team that we'll recruit will include a field officer who will go out and, well, first they'll be online at first looking at, there's a lot of data online in terms of what habitat and soil data, all these different kind of physical factors and ecological factors. You can say, well, here's the ecological potential of the land, here's what it might look like. Then they'll go out and look at the land itself from anyone who's signed up to, any landowner signed up to the project, and they'll make some proposals and give that farmer or that estate manager or that property owner some options, some proposals on what they want to do, and then link those to another member of the team will be the enterprise manager. So they'll say, well, they'll be able to identify what other revenue streams associated with those land use change. Of course, carbon offsetting is a big relevant one at the minute, but there'll be other kinds of opportunities as well. So we'll give the landlord, here's kind of your ecological potential, here's some of your revenue potential from that. You've got a range of other concerns and things to think about in the way your operations work. Mm-hmm. What's compatible, what makes sense as a first step for you, and we can how do we facilitate you to get any funding that's needed to implement that change, to take it forward, and just try to provide as much as possible, I guess, the most painless one-stop shop through all of that process is that kind of evaluation of what a good step is. Taking that through, often that will need to go through a kind of a grant system that can be very bureaucratic and draining. So how can we work with you to facilitate you through that?
It links quite nicely into the next question in terms of, you said land use, so carbon offsetting. I don't like that term, but that is, for example, an example you've said that can change the way that the land's used. But in terms of ecotourism, that's proven many times all around the world to be a way of bringing in new revenue streams, but protecting nature as well. Is the African Highlands somewhere you would encourage people to visit? Is it worth exploring, having a staycation there? And does that then help the project in any way?
Yes. And African Highlands has pointed to the potential and the really strong growth in global ecotourism, nature-based tourism. And it's happening in Scotland anyway, in the Highlands anyway. Up here, tourism, I think, is also seen as a bit of a double-edged sword. So our intention is to face into that issue because, I don't know if you're familiar with the North Coast 500, but
I have been recommended it and then also not recommended it. So I definitely...
You've heard both sides, yeah. And communities can end up a bit, so the communities that are, people in communities who are benefiting from that tourism are very supportive of it. People who are suffering from the congestion that it creates and some of the impacts it leaves behind are saying, hang on, we didn't ask for this. Tourism is not the only answer or isn't the answer at all. So I think we will look to see, well, how do we surface that and have a conversation around the fact that tourism is growing in this landscape anyway. What can we do to shape that so that we get the most benefits that we can from it? And that kind of staycation idea you talked about, Rebecca, where it's kind of slow tourism, and people spend longer in an area and kind of immersing themselves in it and getting more of a relationship with it, and therefore concentrating the economic benefit of their stay in a small community. That kind of a small amount of money in a small community can be really significant, and help that money to circulate within that community before it heads off to Inverness or somewhere else south. that's a key part of what we want to achieve. So that again, that's about relationships within that community and people who are providing for tourism, supplying each other. So that again, that helps that money circulate. So if we can foster that then and get that right, then I think, yes, the communities here and businesses here will continue to benefit from that tourism and see that grow, but in a way that is as sustainable as possible and in a way that has at least the minimum impact on others who are doing business or just living in the landscape. So from our point of view, this nature-based economy, tourism is inevitably significant within that, but we also need this economy to be a bit more diverse and to produce stuff from this landscape. So it's not just a kind of a vicarious experience for others. And so from that point of view, that's why we want farming to be one of the earliest projects that gets going. We'd love to do stuff with forestry and non-timber forest products and things that kind of cross over to the tourism industry, but locally produced produce, so or in wild food. There's lots of interesting, really small micro distilleries, micro breweries. All those sorts of things can have a relationship with the land, connect with the land, feeding into a range of markets, including the tourism market, and can sustain jobs here.
Just touching on tree plant, because it is so talked about, everyone's doing it. Every product you seem to buy, if it's an eco one, you plant a tree. I've heard some very disturbing stories of airlines draining peatlands to tree plant, which is totally counterproductive, but also particularly in Ireland, planting non-native trees. And when you look at the stats of carbon offsetting programs, most of them, actually majority of them, I think it's 85% not following through on what they say. What's your take on tree planting, and what's the right way of doing it?
It's almost become a glib answer now, as people say, right tree, right place. And while that's a cliche, there's truth in it. The problem is it's open to interpretation. But what we're learning now much more about the interaction between vegetation and soil. And that's a key interface, because it's certainly in the Highlands and in much of Britain, we've got carbon-rich soils, peat being the obvious example. And where if you're planting, if you dig a hole into that soil, you will expose some of that soil to the air. If it's peat, if it starts to dry out, so that will oxidize and you release carbon dioxide. So just about any planting exercise will start off carbon negative, because you release some soil carbon. And therefore you need to be clear that fairly soon after that, the tree that you've planted will grow, and the carbon that it's sequestering in its timber and the way it's interacting with the soil below will get you back to carbon positive. And it's understanding that dynamic that's key. So there's long been a presumption against planting against deep peat. That's entirely appropriate. There are signs that the definition of deep peat might be, it's currently 50 centimetres in Scotland. In England, they've reduced that to 30 centimetres. So that's 30 centimetres over is deep peat. Don't plant on that. Whether that's quite the right metric to use, I don't know, but certainly in principle, we need to be really circumspect about where we plant and understand the soil, understand the species you're planting, as you mentioned. Not only will it succeed on that site, but if carbon is a driver for that, then what should that species be? What's the trade-off between fast-growing species and slower-growing species? So if we're looking to sequester at speed, you might say, well, if we get faster-growing species in, that would be a good choice. If the intention is then to fell that for timber, what happens to that timber? Do you just then release that carbon again when it's processed? So that kind of whole life carbon budget is key. Whereas if you're creating native woodland or woodland that's going to be permanent as a forest, then that's like a long-term carbon bank. So we need a bit of we need quite a practical, pragmatic approach to, we want to get to net zero as quickly as we can, but we want to keep that and go beyond that after that. So we need some short-term investments and we need some long-term banking. And that's going to need a mix of responses in terms of what woodland can do for that, where woodland should do that, and how that's done.
With carbon offsetting and all of that, what's your general take on it? Are you seeing it as a positive thing, or generally are you seeing a movement that's just going in the complete wrong direction?
That's undetermined. It's definitely got huge potential to be a positive thing. And I think it's often talked about as a nature-based solution. We sell carbon offsetting units, and we sell as a nature-based solution. We sell that to, we're very careful about who we sell to. So if a buyer comes to us and wants to buy, we sell carbon offset units. They're accredited effectively by a third party in a system that's been a model that was developed by the Forestry Commission. So it's got that kind of, we see that as kind of the scientific evidence behind to say this is real carbon. For a start, that was important to us. When a buyer approaches us and says we want to buy some units to voluntarily offset our footprint, we want to know, well, what is your footprint? Do you understand what it's made of? Have you done the homework to analyze that? And crucially, what is your plan to reduce that over time?
And not just carry on business as usual, profit
Exactly.
not affected, let's carry on, and then let's just tick a box, right?
Yeah. And then we also tell them, this is, as far as we can tell, the market's not transparent. So these are all kind of private transactions. When someone sells carbon, it's not, the price isn't published anywhere. But as far as we can tell, we're expensive. And so we tell people, we're expensive. Do you still want it? And generally they do. And so that starts to, just in those conversations, you start to get a feel for each other. They're looking, it's buyers who want to know the carbon's real, and they're interested in the co-benefits, as they describe it. So the fact that the carbon units we sell are associated with a woodland that we planted, not for carbon. We actually planted it, well, as part of our rewilding work on land the one bit of land that we own. And it was an afterthought that we developed the carbon unit from it. So we tell people, this isn't a carbon-based woodland. This is about our rewilding mission. So people are drawn to that as well. And just recently, we haven't actually transferred any money yet, but we've committed to sharing a portion of each carbon sale with the local community.
Interesting.
So we just need to go through I need to come up with basically a piece of paper that talks to those community groups and says, we'll give you this money. We'd like you to spend it on something that connects your community with the land and develops that relationship with nature.
I love that.
But to give them as much agency as possible in terms of how they do that, so that they've kind of got, I guess, a share in the natural capital of the land around them. And we'd love to establish that as a kind of as common practice. And so from that point of view, we're interested in showing others who produce carbon that you can be no worse off or maybe better off if you share, rather than just look to kind of bring all the money in, because the people who are buying this carbon at this price are interested in being part of that story.
Absolutely. No, I really love that. What would you say is the one thing people need to be mindful of, or maybe the question they need to ask if they're engaging in carbon offsetting, paying a monthly fee, whatever? I know you can get energy companies, you can change your bills now to make sure that they say they're carbon. There's so much marketing and sometimes, unfortunately, greenwashing going on. What question would you suggest the everyday person asks before engaging in that?
I think the crucial challenge for climate change is reducing emission. It starts with that. So is there a clear pathway, credible pathway to minimizing carbon emissions? And then if there is, I think after that, I think the next important question is if you're using offsets to transition your way down towards zero carbon or minimal carbon, if you literally can't do it without that, then is that offset nature-based? So because we're also in the climate emergency, the nature emergency are twinned. So if we try to solve the climate emergency by kind of planting just crops of carbon, and that's the pure answer, then yes, it's all trees and it all sounds great, but actually that's doing much less for nature. and can have opportunity costs for nature. So that's, we're not against, I think commercial forestry and that kind of tree cropping and timber cropping does have an important role to play in answering the climate emergency, because that's where kind of the short-term fast gains can come from if it's done right. And obviously it's an important economic resource, but even a kind of timber crop like that can be managed in a nature-friendly way. So the more widespread that is, and the more mindful it is, just those questions of how it's done, that can work alongside purely native woodland for ecological purposes. And we'd love to see a much more diverse forestry sector grow. And we'd love to see this in African Highlands kind of being able to kind of exemplify this of productive native woodlands. So low intensity forestry based on kind of continental methods, where people are, instead of clear felling, they're just over in a year taking out a few stems, milling them locally, processing, kind of turning them into timber products locally. So that again, that money stays local instead of being taken off on a logging trailer to Inverness is around here that some of the big mills are. And then all that money is instantly left that community. So the more we can do that, allows small businesses to do something. It could be one-man bands. It just sustains jobs that way and keeps money moving around, whilst providing you've got a productive and economic forest that is also really good habitat. What's
the one piece of advice? I've talked about obviously advice of people engaged in tree planting, but for the everyday person that might not be able to become a climate activist or conservationist, what can we do if we have a piece of garden, a small piece of garden, or even just a balcony? Can we individually support nature and rewilding as such?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's another cliche, but think global and act local. That's absolutely holds true. And so, yeah, anything you can do to plant native species or flowering plants that support your local pollinators, those populations there under huge pressure. In fact, that kind of pollination ecological function is one of the key natural processes that we need to support and restore. So certainly gardens, no mow May is one of the slogans that went around Twitter this year. So asking people not to mow their lawns all through May, because it allows more species to flower and that supports bee populations. Having a wild corner to your garden, planting native flowers, planting native shrubs, trees, get involved, local volunteer groups, all sorts of ways. Just kind of looking around and seeing actually anywhere, even if you live in an inner city, or anywhere, that there'll be something you can do with that kind of, with some natural habitat that can restore that. We do have a very degraded natural landscape right across the UK. It doesn't have to be like this. There is so much more possible, and that does not have to threaten anybody. That can create opportunities. So yeah, raise your eyes above the horizon and see there's the potential for restoration, and a really rich natural environment around us remains, despite all the doom and gloom that gets around. So invest in that hope.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been amazing, Alan.